Poor, thank you very much indeed for your time. So do you think Volodymyr Zelenskyy is correct in his assessment that many powers around the world are waiting or biding their time, if you'll forgive the pun, to November, and we get the result of that November's presidential election?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on. In fact, the title of my book is Westlessness, and I think that's one of the themes that's hanging over this NATO summit, which is the Western powers, which of course have all converged at the NATO summit, have limited means to actually force the outcomes that they want in the Ukraine conflict. Zelenskyy and the Ukraine he's leading is probably at its most difficult point in this war since probably the summer of 2022. The early part, of course, was horrendous for Zelenskyy. So I'm not surprised that he is actually imploring more support because of the uncertainty around November. And clearly this NATO summit is also hugely overshadowed by Joe Biden's weak debate performance and the rebellion in the Democrat ranks in America that might seek to replace him, all of which makes a Trump presidency much more likely, which in turn makes maybe not an abandonment of Ukraine, but a total change in Zelensky's support from the US very, very likely, much more likely than it was a few weeks ago.
No, you'll forgive me my mistake. Westlessness, not restlessness, although there is, as you mentioned, some restlessness within the Democratic Party as, one after another comes out to suggest Joe Biden should step down. I mean, is this a week of reckoning for him? He comes into it with his reputation diminished by that TV debate. Could this summit make or break his presidency?
You're absolutely right. And you know what, Aaron? Almost any public appearance he now makes between now and November could make or break his presidency. He doesn't really have the opportunity for another slightly sleepy, slightly narcoleptic performance. There has to be the best Biden that there possibly can be at every stage. And to be fair to Biden, from the speeches that we've seen, the clips that we've seen, he's been pretty strong in advocating for NATO. And for he's the host, of course, and the US is the biggest contributing country to NATO. So he's done a reasonable job so far. But just that sense of uncertainty means that a lot of the visiting presidents, defense ministers, foreign ministers, they're also finding time for sideline meetings with people associated with Trump. That's because they're trying to hedge against the possibility. They're in DC right now. Let's get those connections to people like General Keith Kellogg and others and Mike Pompeo. That's being reported in the media as well. And that does undermine Biden's position somewhat. But I think the ultimate takeaway from that is this is meant to be a showcase for Western unity. It's a NATO summit, 75th anniversary since NATO's founding in 1949. And there are just so many other distractions going on that I think that key message is a little harder to sell without a lot of scrutiny.
Yes, well, you mentioned the anniversary, and it's likely that will be played down, at least celebration of that will be played down, given what's going on in Ukraine and indeed in Gaza. But on that 75th anniversary and the future of NATO, do you think it's fair to suggest that it faces a number of seismic problems from both outside but also within?
Definitely. I mean, something like NATO will continue to exist. But ever since the end of the Cold War, which was, of course, NATO's founding premise was to face off against the USSR in 1949, it's always had to reinvent itself to find a new role. Clearly, when Russia invaded Ukraine with the full-scale invasion just over 2 years ago, NATO's existence was totally validated. This is, of course, the first summit with the Finns and the Swedes, who are recent additions to the alliance. So in some respects, NATO is in a stronger position than it's ever been. But on the other hand, its ability to force the outcomes that it wants in Ukraine without being directly involved have been very limited. And meanwhile, the world around NATO is changing very, very quickly in terms of China. Your report mentioned Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban, by the way, had flown to Beijing shortly before coming to Washington, D.C., and Xi Jinping warmly greeted him, and Orban was also seeing Putin as well. So the world is changing. Erdogan was at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting as well just a little while ago. So there's a lot happening around the Western world, and I think the key center of Western military power, which is NATO, I think is going to struggle to come to terms with how much the world is changing around it.
And much of that will no doubt be detailed in the Great Global Rebalancing. Westlessness, let me just put that out there one more time again. Samir, thank you very much indeed. Good to talk to you today.